he says, neighbor love requires us sometimes to act. And while the violence is regrettable and needs to be repented for, it's sometimes the lesser of two evils. Maintaining to ethical purism in the name, at the sacrifice of practicality is not justice. This actually is, you find this actually in the Christian tradition, even in the Middle Ages. Christian soldiers returning, even from what's considered a just war, were required always to go on a retreat, to repent for the sin of having shed blood, even if they did so in a just war. So the inherent sinfulness and regrettableness of war was seen, it was just sometimes seen as the lesser of two evils. Still evil nonetheless. Finally, Augustine also said, the use of deadly force is authorized for state powers only, sovereigns, kings, emperors, things like that. This gets lost all the time. Augustine said in the individual life of a Christian, you must be an absolute pacifist. You're walking down the street and a mugger puts a gun to your head. Augustine said as a Christian, you cannot offer resistance. You must accept death because you cannot claim to be a Christian and resort to violence. Well, hold on a second. How could he justify war? Because when a soldier is standing on the battlefield, said Augustine, he's not there as an individual citizen. He's a tool of the state. He's an instrument of the government. And the government has a duty to protect the common good, the community. And so he says the ethic of an individual is not the same as the ethic of an emperor. States have different duties than individual citizens. Some of you are shaking your head. You're not buying it. I'll leave that between you and Augustine. Many people dismiss Augustine and say, oh my gosh, Augustine is the one who killed pacifism in the Christian church, right? No, that's not entirely fair. If you're a Christian, you have to accept that we do live in a sinful world and that people are greedy. You have to accept the fact that we have an obligation to defend the weak and vulnerable. I'll translate this into real-life situations. Currently in Sudan, there is a genocide going on. What is the moral response to that? To wag our fingers and say, stop that, or I'll say, stop that again? Or for an extremely powerful military like the United States is to ride over a sovereign national border in the name of defending weak and powerless people. You tell me what the Christian response is. Also, Augustine never claimed the use of deadly force is a good. He always claimed it was an evil. It's an evil. It's just the lesser of two evils. And again, the use of deadly force is reserved for the state alone. Individual citizens must be pacifists. But with Augustine, we get a Christian ethic of empire. Force is now acceptable. I like to say Augustine is the one who brings the gun into the church. While Augustine originally identified 3 criteria that had to be met before you could have a just war, you had to have just cause, you had to have right intention, which was peace, and you could only be declared by a legitimate authority, the sovereign. Over the centuries, the Christian just war theory has become much more elaborate. And it's typically presented in 2 principal categories. You get a little Latin, you're at a Catholic school. Jus ad bellum and jus in bello, Latin terms for justice in going to war and justice in war. The first column on the left talks about the conditions you have to meet in order to go to war. First off, you have to have just cause. In other words, things like national self-defense, defending the weak and vulnerable, defending human rights. These count as typical just causes. National expansion doesn't count. Fear of your enemy doesn't count. You have to have a just cause. Secondly, it has to be declared by a legitimate or competent authority. Right intention. For Augustine, the end of war was peace. He says in the City of God, people go to war for peace. And that sounds like an oxymoron, fighting for peace. But he says the goal of war is what he calls the tranquillitatis ordinis, the tranquility that comes from order. In a chaotic world where sin reigns supreme, you have to fight for peace. It's not going to just fall from the trees unpicked. Last resort. This gets skipped over all the time. Recourse to war is permitted if and only if all reasonable peaceful alternatives have been fully exhausted. All reasonable peaceful alternatives have been fully exhausted. You have to have probability of success. A war is not just if it will not yield positive results, And finally, what I call macro proportionality, which is that recognizing that war is always destructive, you got to decide that, okay, if we go to war, there's going to be death, there's going to be destruction, there's going to be hunger. Is it worth it? Will more good result? Now, here's what gets lost in this all the time. Nice little checklist, right? Check, 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 check. In the mouths of politicians, I don't care if they're Republicans or Democrats, the just war theory has been reduced to just cause. Never trust a politician when they say this war is just. Go find a theologian. We're very cheap. It's not just about as if I have just cause, therefore I have a just war. No. The just war tradition says all 6 of those criteria have to be met for a war to be considered just. They're not ranked in order, like, well, I got 4 out of 6, so it's, it's mostly just. No, it's like being pregnant. Either it's just or it's not. Either you are or you're not. It's an all or nothing thing. Then it gets to jus in bello, and jus in bello concerns rules on the battlefield. How do soldiers behave in war? There's the old adage, all's fair in love and war. Well, that's not really true. If you study the history of war, there have always been rules to war. Chivalry codes, negotiations, treaties. How do wars begin? How do wars end? Right? First rule in war, in the just war theory, is discrimination between combatants and non-combatants. It is immoral, illegal, however you want to phrase it, to intentionally target civilians. Intentionally target civilians. And then you also have the question about legitimate and illegitimate targets. Is it legitimate in the 2003 invasion of Iraq to target the electrical grid of a city like Baghdad in the peak of summer? Can you intentionally target sewage treatment plants and bridges to food supplies? When you're doing that, you're condemning the civilians to death. Microproportionality concerns the amount of force to use. You don't use a nuclear weapon to take out a sniper, right? Your use of force has to be measured. Restraint, show some restraint, right? And then in the Christian tradition, it usually comes down to those 2, but quite honestly, in history, there's been more. No means mala and say is you can't use any intrinsically evil weapons. Weapons of mass destruction, chemical, biological, nuclear weapons, to which I would also add landmines and depleted uranium shells, which kill more civilians than soldiers, always. And also treatment of prisoners of war and rules of surrender. Now, I could go on literally for hours and days on the just war theory. I eat, sleep, drink, and breathe this thing. So I'm showing some micro-proportionality as we speak here. There's a lot of questions that the just war theory raises. Who is the competent authority when all wars have global implications? Can you honestly say that you're meeting the needs of proportionality when every war can go chemical or biological or nuclear on us? Every war has the implicit threat of being disproportionate in a world of modern technology. What about weapons of mass destruction? What about wars for humanitarian intervention? What about post-war responsibilities? What do warring parties owe to the people where they fight the war? If you notice, the century-old tradition says nothing about that. Nothing about what's called jus post bellum. What do we, the United States of America, owe the people of Iraq? I'm going to put it in your face tonight. If you think the invasion of Iraq was immoral, illegal, or wrong, then what do we owe the people of Iraq and Afghanistan, if you think that was, for having destroyed the infrastructure of their nation? Did we topple a despot? I'm not going to argue that, yes. But is that enough? The just war theory is, people say, oh, come on. This is something a bunch of philosophers and theologians cooked up. Yeah, it is, actually. Does anyone really do this? Every U.S. military academy teaches this. Every Marine carries in his pocket a laminated card that says rules of engagement. It's jus in bello. This thing has stood the test of time. It was born in the era of the 4th century. Actually, the Greeks. It started with the Greeks. Evolved into the early 4th and 5th centuries. It survived and was considered relevant in the Middle Ages. It has evolved with the nuclear era and now the age of terrorism.